So if you're talking about a particular subject and it might get quite tense, then I might break the group up into smaller groups, which is a good way of, helping people share what they think without thinking they've got to do it in front of everyone, particularly if it's something that's controversial.
The question is from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Paul from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Rich from Thinking Focus.
Hi, I'm Rob from Thinking Focus.
And the question is, I'm dreading this slightly, how can I get the discussion going without it leading to arguments?
Why are you dreading it?
Yeah, what does that mean?
What are you saying? What are you saying?
You're basically badging both of us as argument.
You are, yeah, and that's made me feel unsafe right at the beginning of this conversation.
I know.
Cool. We'll pause for a second while I explain that this is part of a series that we've done on facilitating, because we get asked a lot about how we facilitate and what we do. And so we thought we'd create a few podcasts explaining some of the tools and techniques. And to do that, I've got Rob and Rich, who've got about 500 years of facilitation experience between
It's going up every time we do
every
this.
Time. Well, is that how long these podcasts are? We've had another 100 years.
Yeah, you're like Time Lords. You are the facilitators of the Time Lords. Right. So, actually, how do you get discussion going without it kind of leading to conflict? Because I guess at the heart of this is you want some tension, but not too much tension. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's dead right. You want a little bit, but you don't want all out war, do you?
Yeah, they're throwing stuff at each other in the room.
Yeah, you don't want
gone
that.
Too far.
Yeah.
I mean, the essence to this, obviously, is that you want people to share their views, don't you? And the thing about it is that we all have slightly different views about stuff, and it's the opposing views that are likely to cause the arguments. So, there is a sort of an element to the fact that we will probably get an argument or a disagreement between a couple of views at some point or other during any sort of session that we're going to facilitate. So I think it's a really great question.
So is that the place to start then? How do you get people to share their views? Sort of that mix of feeling safe to say what they want to say, but really getting, some controversial views out on the table.
I think one of the things is in some of the ground rules that you set. So we talked in previous podcasts, actually, before ground rules about creating a safe environment and helping the group build trust in you as the facilitator. So that's all key. The setup's key. Having some ground rules, though, or sharing some information. So one of the things we do quite a lot is we talk about how we think affects how we feel, affects the actions we take, the results we get, and how that goes round. And how one of the important things when we think is we don't always just think nice, happy thoughts, do we, all the time? Quite often you might think some unhelpful thoughts. Sometimes you might think stuff that isn't pleasant. Now, that stuff's still all valid. So what we might do is do a piece of input at the beginning to talk maybe a little bit about why teams that are prepared to share some of their dislikes and unhelpful thinking and work on them with good intent to help them get to a destination or solution is a healthy thing to do. And we can therefore encourage people to share what they don't like, what they're struggling with, or what makes them feel stuck as part of the process. So if you do that, what you're kind of doing is owning the fact that when we talk through some stuff, we'll talk about what you like, we'll talk about what you don't like. And that means that can flow a bit easier.
And you're setting up a permission, aren't you, for that to happen?
Yeah.
Because if you set that up very early, then although people might not necessarily sort of buy into it immediately, it's been stated as you say, a rule of engagement, as a way, the ground rules, how we're going to work together today. And so the testing of it will happen by some people quicker than others. But you're enabling that permission piece to be, sort of front and foremost of the whole sharing of views, so that people can actually speak openly and know that they're going to be heard and that other people's views are just as valued as theirs.
I think I like to use the phrase quite often, hopes and fears. So if you're talking about a particular subject and it might get quite tense, then I might break the group up into smaller groups, which is a good way of, helping people share what they think without thinking they've got to do it in front of everyone, particularly if it's something that's controversial. So put them in smaller groups and get them to talk through hopes and fears. So whatever the subject is, what is it that you're really hopeful for? But also on the other side, what is it that you're fearful of? And that discussion in smaller groups of maybe 3 and 4 is easier for people to do because perhaps it's not in front of a whole group of 20 or something. It's easy for people to do. It's easier for people to be a bit more vulnerable and honest. And then what you do is you bring all that back together and you go, okay, group 1, take us through some of the stuff that you're hopeful for and some of the stuff that you're fearful of. And they'll share. And then you'll get other groups chiming in and go, well, we thought that as well. And so did we. And we had that point. So you've started to create a bit of common ground around some of the hopes and some of the fears. So whilst you might have some tension, what you're doing is by breaking out, you're making it easier for people to share that with the whole group.
I kind of like that, and it sort of brings me back to 2-3 podcasts ago when we were talking about actually how you get people to contribute and the way you construct exercises. By giving the exercise a structure, so it's not what you want, it's what are your hopes, what are your fears. You've now created permission to talk about the fears. So anybody who wants to have a contrary view or wants to talk about something difficult, there's kind of a box to put it in. It's almost like I'm allowed to do that, and also anybody else can go, that's fine. I don't need to get upset by it because they're just doing the exercise.
Exactly, and you can do other things as well. So you can do stuff like let's say there's a particular change that's gone on in an organization. So you can also do we're going to go into some small groups, spend 10 minutes talking about all the reasons why this won't work and get them doing that because that gives them permission to do that. And then you might have another 10 minutes that sort of says, okay, out of all those reasons it won't work, which ones are real and based in now, which ones are not real and are based in something from the past we're hanging on to. Something like that, for example. Because again, you're getting people to work through something, to think through something, to test this either unhelpful thinking they got in their head or whatever. And you're trying to move them through a process. You're not saying they're right or wrong. You're just trying to get them to think something through.
And I think what you did, it just is you were constructing them, and I don't even know if you know you're doing it. What you're doing each time is giving them a frame to have contrarian view. So each of those you talked about, it's, well, is it good or is it bad? Is it right or is it wrong? Is it now or is it the past? You're giving a framework that allows people to have that opposing view structure come out really safely.
Well, the other element to that is that, we are all, inherently selfish in our views. In other words, we think that we might have an opinion. Yeah, I know.
You are.
I wasn't talking about selfishness as a characteristic. We are selfish in our thinking. What I mean by that is that we might think until, like your hopes and fears exercise that you described really well, until we hear that somebody else has got a different view to ours, we weren't aware of that view because we're only holding our own view because that's the one that we're very familiar with. So not only is the permission thing occurring here, but you're actually giving other people the chance to go, oh, somebody has just said something that is contrary to how I think or feel about something, never realized that they might hold that view. That's interesting, isn't it? So you're creating a diffusion to a likely argument starting anyway, because you're helping that individual to realize that somebody's got a different view to them in the first place.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's kind of an endowment effect on our own views.
Yeah.
They're the ones we've put effort into.
Yeah.
They're the ones we put time into. So we kind of prefer them. We're looking for evidence to support them. And what we're doing in the workshop is probably challenging quite a lot of what people believe.
Yeah, just getting you to think it through. How many times do we all think something in our heads, and then when you've got to go and explain it or talk it through with somebody, through the process of doing it, you kind of go, I'm not sure my argument is as strong as I thought it was.
Well, and that leads to another key bit of insight that we could give here, in the fact that somebody who does give an opinion or a view, actually asking them for the why behind that opinion is really critical. So that, if somebody's sort of saying something and it might be quite controversial, it might be something that is in opposition to maybe what other people have been saying so far, we can't just let that that statement be made, whatever it is, without asking for the why behind that statement, so that A, it can be justified, B, other people can understand it. But it gives a greater explanation behind that point or that discussion topic that's been raised, so that it's not just, oh, this is my opinion and I can't back it up.
So you're driving it to a better, a deeper common understanding. So the whole group is seeing all the different perspectives. I mean, the other thing I've seen, and I've done before in these workshops when I've been working, is when somebody has a really contrary view, when they have something that's almost like the group's going type view, is to create some space for it. So create space for that person to be allowed to have that view, but also create some space around that view so other people don't feel like they have to fight it, that they can just, all right, that's really interesting. Let's hear more about that. We'll come back to other stuff in a second, but let's get that one on the table so we all understand it.
Yeah. Tell me. I like the phrase. Tell me more. Tell me a bit more about that. How have you arrived at that thought process, Paul? Tell me a bit more, and people will then do that.
Because I think what we're really talking about here. Back to some of our core material and some of the podcasts from. I think we're on. This will be number 90 something, and we're going back to some of our early podcasts. It's kind of. Well, which brain is answering? Is it the rational human brain that's answering, or is it that emotive brain that's answering? And if the second somebody has a different opinion, arguments come when it becomes emotive.
Well, that's a really good point. You can see that, can't you? Because have you got two chimps?
Yeah.
To use the chimp paradox analogy from Dr. Steve Peters, have you got two chimps having a conversation? Or have you got a chimp having a conversation with a human, or have you got two humans? So, and that's all okay, because we know that's normal and natural that will happen.
Or as one of my workshop delegates this week said, or have you got to the point where one of the chimps is now picking up his poo and starting to throw it?
Yeah, all that stuff. I think as a facilitator, if you realise you've got to the point where there's chimps running around the room throwing poo at each other, perhaps you might need to go, okay, let's just take 10, cool off. We'll come back to this in a bit. Just going back to an earlier point, we talked about frameworks to help discussion. Frameworks are really, really good. A framework could be just think through these 3 questions, or it could be think through these 4 questions, or it could be think about hopes and fears, or whatever. So it doesn't have to be anything tremendously technical, but a framework can help control some of those chimps, because it creates time to go through a process, and the act of going through the process helps you to become a bit more rational when thinking about something. Whereas if you just throw a question out to the group, you can get more emotive responses, and you might want that, but you might not want that. So I think the act of going off in groups with a framework to think through can help people work through that process.
The framework could be, sorry, Rich, the framework could be for the whole session, whether that's a day, 2 days, half a day, whatever it happens to be. The framework could be, back to your rules of engagement, description. This is how we're going to agree to work today, isn't it? And obviously that's set in conjunction with the group and in agreement with the group. One of the things that brought to mind for me was, the provision of something like a parking space. So that you've got those things that people might have an opinion about that come up that are not necessarily relevant to moving this particular piece of facilitation forward, but nonetheless should be acknowledged and should be captured. Could be put in somewhere like a parking space, could be, written up, put somewhere to be dealt with at another time or in a different setting, because that's a relevant thing to do.
So by parking space, what you're really talking about is some formalized way of saying, I've heard you, we've captured it.
Yeah.
We've put it somewhere so you can see it. It's very physical.
Correct.
But it's not a now conversation. It's now for later.
Correct. And again, that might be part of the framework, the agreement for how we work today, so that people go, okay, I know that, I'm not just being ignored.
Yeah. So you're taking you're actually using that act to take the tension out of that moment, capture the idea, which might be a great idea, might be an irrelevant idea. It doesn't really matter. But you're diffusing that tension to make sure that you can stay focused on the conversation you want the group to have.
I think as well, as a facilitator, there are times when you can see that the conversation's gone off down a rabbit hole and people are into the detail on something and it's not necessarily where they need to be. So there are times when that happens, when you have to say, right, I'm just going to ask you to pause there because we've wandered off topic, and this is where you might do this, isn't it, Rob? You might go,
Mm-hmm.
so let's just park that. I'm just going to put that here because we know we need to pick it up, but we need to get back to the conversation over here. Sometimes those diversions are worthwhile and you pursue them. Sometimes you realise they're not. And you have to just be quite firm about that and say, we're going to stop that there and we're going to come back to the other discussion.
So it's a bit of a strange question, but is there ever an occasion where you actually go, you know what, I do want an argument here?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I had one a couple of weeks ago. And I wouldn't say an argument. You want a debate. But I had one a couple of weeks ago where I knew someone in the room held a different view to what was being said, but they weren't bringing it out. So I looked to create an opportunity for it to come out later on in the day to say, right, okay, we've been through a lot today. What have we missed? What views does anyone still hold that we haven't discussed? It still didn't come out.
So you're basically trying to do it in a really rational way and they're still not saying anything.
And it still didn't come out. So this was a 2-day thing. So we left that evening and I thought, I know that person disagrees with this. So I did another thing the next morning, which was almost to say, what is going to cause our plan to fail? This is a framework. What's going to cause our plan to fail? What have I not said that I should have said? What do I believe that I am not sharing? And what I then said is, we need to talk through this stuff, because if we don't, you're going to have to accept that you had your opportunity to say stuff and you didn't say it. And if you walk out the room not saying it today, then you have to let go of it. It's gone. And it brought out the particular issue, and it brought out 3 or 4 others as well. And it caused a discussion for about 3 hours that wasn't necessarily in the plan. But without that discussion, we couldn't have carried on. So it was really worthwhile. So the point is, sometimes that happens and you've got to try and force it to come out.
But what's really interesting in your description of that is that actually, just going back to my original question, you found a really rational way. You tried 2 or 3 different ways. But what you didn't do was ever let it bubble over into a full-on argument or an emotive bit. So it's kind of, again, going back to that chimp paradox, the role of the facilitator is to keep the room full of human.
It did get quite emotive.
Right.
Once we got going.
But no poo throwing.
There was no poo throwing, and I was working with very, very good people in terms of, good ethics, good morals, all passionate about what they do. None of it was personal, but they were all so caught up in it, and there's so much invested in it, and they all liked each other, so they didn't always say what they felt.
Right. So again, in the emotive bit, what I'm hearing is it was a motive about, it wasn't a motive against each other.
No, it was based on passion.
No, it wasn't a motive against each other. And so it wasn't an argument, but I did want people to debate stuff, and people did get emotional because passionate is probably a better word, did get passionate because they believe so strongly in something. But I just think that's good. I think there's nothing wrong with that. You might say there's a bit of chimp in that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And what we got was the people listening to this, hearing it their chimps would have been triggered, but because they were perhaps a little bit more emotionally aware, realised we've got to work through this in order to succeed.
Yeah.
So we got to that point. So in the end, it was fantastic. It was brilliant. It was exactly what needed to happen.
So is sort of a summary, just to tie the whole thing together, I'm kind of almost hearing that the role of the facilitator is to find this really weird space. You don't want it to be too rational because not everything might come out. You kind of want it to be emotive and passionate. I think I love that word, without it ever becoming personal.
Yeah.
Because then you're into a fight between people and nothing good's going to come of that. Is that a fair description? Sort of that?
Yeah. Because what is an argument? An argument is having opposing views about a particular topic. What you don't want it to be is a personal attack on another individual. So actually it's, can we have a bit of health? And you said this right at the beginning, I think, Paul, you can have some healthy tension, and the healthy tension is probably really productive, but it has to be managed and facilitated. And having a framework or structure well planned out to enable that to happen actually makes the facilitation effective and causes that group, whoever you're working with, to get to a place where they can have opposing views aired shared and a conclusion drawn.
I think, sorry, going back to what you're saying, a room that's too rational is boring. If everyone's just really rational and, we're discussing stuff and it gets a bit boring, you want a bit of passion injected. That is a good thing. Too much human and rationality doesn't always equal a good thing. You want a mix of both. So you're right, it is a bit of a...
There's a fine line there.
It's a fine line that you're walking. And in essence, what we're talking about here is some of these techniques about inviting people in to share their views, using frameworks, using small groups, and then letting them report back to big groups. All of those are, in essence, containing the group in this space between passion and personal, so that there's a lot of energy and there's a lot of passion and a lot of belief that comes out in the discussion, without it ever being, but you did this and I don't like that and it's not fair, and on all the stuff that breaks it down into a bad argument.
I disagree.
Wow. I was going to say, so close. So close. I was about to say, we've done the whole podcast and not argued. And then, Richard, you let us down.
Well, how dare you say I let us down? I'm just being passionate about getting it right.
Okay, I'll give you that.
Next time on The Question Is.
I don't think any of us go into, a facilitation of a workshop without having an outcome in mind. And we're quite clear about what the outcome might be. But it's a little bit like agile leadership. You're not quite necessarily sure how you're going to get to the outcome. You've got a plan, but you typically have 2 or 3 plans, each of which could take you to the outcome. You might have a preferred one.
To find out how Thinking Focus can unlock the potential within your organization, go to www.thinkingfocus.com, where you'll discover more about the work we do, helping our clients increase productivity and enable change.